and welcome to the Infinite Improvisation Podcast, Adventures in Music and Creativity. And I am Steve Treseler, joined by Lauren Best.
Happy to be back.
Yeah, so in our first season, we were working on answering some questions about why and what and who we are. And now we're going to get into the how. How do we improvise? How do we create new musical ideas or put new artistic works out into the world and get into that process? So these will be a series of 5 mini episodes around the creative practices of infinite improvisation. And largely this will be about the process. It's a how episode, but not necessarily a how-to, like a linear step-by-step process. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that, of the how a creative process versus something that's a little more linear?
You know, I heard someone describe it as a buffet. It was J.D. Derbyshire, who's a comedian and playwright, and they described it as like a creative buffet that, you know, you give yourself lots of different options, and then you see what tastes good, and you see what you feel like choosing from. So I know what you mean with not necessarily a linear step-by-step process. It's not like baking, you know, where we have exact ratios and it's an exact formula. But there's different elements for different times, different purposes, different people.
Yeah, whereas if you're coming up with your own recipe, if you're the one writing the recipe, that certainly could be more of a creative practice. So, whereas something more linear, like you're learning how to change the tire on your car, or learn the D flat major scale, it's something where the outcome is predetermined. You know what the goal is ahead of time when you start. So when we're developing skills, it's some of the most effective way. You know, the research by Anders Ericsson tells us that deliberate practice helps us develop skills in the most efficient way, which is knowing what the outcome is and dividing it up into actionable steps and getting coaching. And that's really important for us as we're learning skills as artists and musicians. But the creative part is different. And we might, when we're going to improvise a piece, compose something, paint an original work, whatever your medium is, you might not know what point B is when you start. When you're done, like, the results might surprise you. So it takes a different approach, and it's less direct, and have to embrace this process of it being, you know, about being more of a wandering, less efficient process. Mm-hmm.
And within that, sometimes we do come up with certain formulas that we feel work for us. Mm-hmm. But well, we've talked before about limitations, right? Certain limitations or formulas that we might adjust. But there are many possible variations and many possible. I mean, even within baking, I do improvise a little bit because I know what some of the formulas are, right? That like, it's kind of, I see it's about this amount of spice, so I can maybe, you know, put in some different spices of my own, because I kind of see where they're going with that. And sometimes I'll think, oh, that creative process worked really well for me before. I see I did some things, so maybe I'll try that again. But there's a lot more, as you're saying, there's a lot more that's unknown or intuitive, or where we kind of leave deliberate blank spaces to fill in later. Yeah,
so the first of these creative practices to get into for this episode is experimentation. A quote from Jacob Bronikowski, which is, "There is a likeness between the creative acts of the mind in art and in science." Which I really like. So experimentation, this is embracing the scientific method, which I think about as how scientists learn more about their domain. It starts with maybe a curiosity, like, oh, what's something I would like an answer to, or a problem, and following your curiosity and setting up experiments. So we can do this with our art, or as a musical experiment, and, you know, you'll be gathering data, and, you know, we may have an idea of we're going to experiment and see what happens. You might have a prediction of, we have a hypothesis, but the results may ultimately surprise us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the idea of multiple possible outcomes, and kind of suspending judgment on those, that we can embrace some of the various possibilities as parts of that process.
So for this concept, this is less of as we go, we'll try to give you even more practical, getting closer to the how-to thing. But the experimentation, it's more of the mindset that we're taking this with the curiosity of a scientist, and that we're gathering data. So our art and our music is very important and special to us. But at the same time, as we're having these experiments, sometimes the results won't be what we expected, or we're not happy with the results. But treating this as a scientist, that we're looking at all of this as data, that we're gathering data. And it doesn't mean you're a bad scientist because your hypothesis wasn't entirely right. Well, then we devise a new experiment, have a new hypothesis, and that's how you get better at science, and that's how you get better at creating things.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And also thinking about, it helps us, I think, separate some of the different elements of the outcome. Like we've talked before about, one outcome is how we feel, like how our emotions feel, how, like, what we're noticing. And then another outcome is how the music actually sounds, or how the creative work actually like impacts us or impacts other people. And there could be other categories we add on to that.
Yeah, and eventually, as you go, we want art and music that really resonates with us and with other people. But the way to get there is through some of this experimentation, having data and throwing things out. You generate lots and lots of data, and when things don't work, being just free to toss it out and try again. Well, I'm doing quotes from Brahms' composer, which I believe is the mark of an artist is how much he throws away. So kind of if your garbage can is most full with your scores that didn't work out, then in the process you'll get to the gems. I mean, we're in the process now of writing our theme song for this podcast, and we'll keep going until we have something that we're happy with and we're very proud of the results. But you can only get there through the messy process. It just doesn't come to beginning to end perfectly formed, like it fell out of the sky, which is a misconception some people have of folks that are creative or talented in some way, that this final product just drops straight from the muse and straight out of your pen or your paintbrush or your voice. But yeah, the process is, just embrace this messiness. You'll be having a lot of experiments, generating lots of data. You're not happy with how some of it turns out, and you make changes, and you just have to be ready for that journey.
Yeah, and then you kind of learn to anticipate that, and that becomes part of it. Like I find sometimes I'll improvise and record it and try to just do a bunch of different recordings in a row. And oftentimes a lot of it, like you're saying, a lot of it I don't want to keep. It's kind of like a lot of run-on sentences sometimes, But then within that, I'm able to notice things, notice patterns, or just notice little moments I want to pick out that I may not have arrived at if I had not been in the middle of those run-on sentences. I wouldn't have necessarily gotten there. It's like it wouldn't make sense for me to be like, I'm going to sit down and I'm only going to play the keepers, like that's not it. That's not how I'm going to get there. I need to go through this process that's very different than what it would be if I was trying to write a song or trying to, even jam with someone else. I'm kind of allowing for a certain kind of mindset or a certain kind of sound.
Yeah. And writers do that with free writing, just write. And then you can get to the good stuff. And that happens with composing. The intro to the song isn't working, and then suddenly something amazing happens, and you're like, oh, this is actually the song. And you had to get through the other stuff. And that can be similar to skill development too. If you're learning how to hit a golf ball and you go to the driving range, I'm only gonna hit it straight down the middle every time. That doesn't quite happen. You've gotta shank them as well.
And it gets us used to that too, so that we kind of can have emotional safety within this broader range of experiences. And I think too that thinking of it like a scientist also encourages us to measure things, even if that's kind of measuring just based on our own observations and not like specifics, but measure things in different ways too. Like notice different aspects of how we're feeling, like noticing, well, I was talking before about our our emotions or what we're feeling in our body, or noticing about our experiences within ourselves, within our emotions or our thoughts, or our physicality, noticing how things actually feel in our body. But also noticing like what we can see and what we can hear, and kind of like teasing out and separating the different aspects of what we're observing.
Yeah.
Does that resonate? Like that sort of separating out some of those elements so that we can, I mean, a lot of it ends up being that we think it's like one thing, and then suddenly we realize, or one hypothesis, right? And then we realize that's actually like a number of different experiments or different elements of this that we're observing at the same time, or we might even revise what the question is.
Yeah. And we'll get to some of those too, when we get to our 5th mini episode on reflection as well, and reflecting and with our experiments and what to do next based on how it feels and how it sounds.
I was going to ask, are there any like kind of tips and I was going to say tips and tricks, but just things about experimenting that you'd say, hey, this is what I've learned about creative experiments, like any sort of, for someone starting off on that adventure, or someone who's listening to this and thinking, I never thought of that as an experiment. I'm going to go do some experiments now. Thank you, Steve. I am now a scientist. How would you like to send them on their way?
So you can think of something that you're curious about. It might even be experimenting, with a new medium, or sometimes I might, a new sound making, a new instrument shows up. Like, I'm going to figure out all the sounds this thing can make, and it can shape into something compelling or interesting, or not. But we'll also this will tie in, all these practices intersect with each other, but with the limitations. So we'll have some in the show notes. We'll share some for musicians, some ways of setting up musical experiments through a limitation menu. So this comes from a book that you can download on the Infinite Improvisation website as well. Called Creativity Triggers for Musicians, and I'm in the process of revising it as the Infinite Improvisation Handbook. So depending on when you're listening to this episode, you'll be able to find it on the website under one of those two names. But diving into having a very specific limitation. So saying, okay, I'm going to experiment, but I'm only going to use the black keys on the piano and one hand, and experiment. And then within that limitation, just see what happens. And can I make something interesting? And I've done other, just limitation like that. A class I was just teaching, I was having some students improvise with just 2 notes, but their job was to try to make someone else laugh with only those 2 notes. So then suddenly they're having to do a lot with dynamics and expressiveness and all of these. So that was just an experiment I set up. And it's not about setting up what's the correct experiment to set up. So I'm going to set up an experiment of having one 5th grader make a group of 5th graders laugh only using 2 notes. So it doesn't have to be all, doesn't have to be super serious, the whole process. So it can be the playful element, which is another mini episode on play. But it can be taking one, narrowing down what tools you're working with. So it could be these notes, it could be this dynamics, it could be this paint color, and then experimenting with it within a narrow scope.
Yeah. I was going to say that fewer options. I find often, I think of an idea and then I have to narrow it down. Or I do an experiment and then I need to narrow it down more. And even though earlier I talked about kind of run-on sentence improvisations where they're we're like free writing, but for improvising. And in that case, my limitation was play short things, don't plan, but I wouldn't start there necessarily. I would start even in a more simpler way. And as you're saying, even just a couple notes, I mean, there's different ways to do it, but I find often it's like less, because by scaling it down, then you start to actually come up with more ideas, So at least, on piano, if I think it's only 2 notes, okay, but I could play those two notes in different octaves, right? And then I start to think of different types of patterns I might not have otherwise. So yeah, I would agree. I would agree with kind of keeping it simple, and then you can always add on more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we go, we'll be doing some of these experiments live on the podcast as we go along. So we want to model this ourselves and have other folks in our online community too come together and do these together as a community, that you're not just in isolation experimenting, bringing forth your results with other people. I guess the other point I wanted to touch on, I mentioned this to you before. Some folks, when I say that I'm a professional musician, they go, "Oh, you're a musician. You must be good at math, because music and math are the same thing." I'm like, and that always made me grumpy, and I didn't quite know how to respond other than like, "Yeah, haha, sure." But now I like to say, I'm like, actually, it's much closer to a science and the scientific method, and talk about what we're talking about with experimenting and making experiments and looking at the results and changing things and seeing what happens. And it's not exact. It isn't art. It's partly, it's partly art, partly science. There's math in there too. But I feel much more comfortable with the creative process being more like the scientific method than turning it into a math formula.
Yeah, and changing variables individually, or maybe a couple at a time. But like, if something different didn't work, rather than starting from scratch, I mean, you are welcome to start from scratch, but you'll learn a lot more by changing like one thing. And then did that thing that you change the outcome as you were expecting? Like, how can it helps, I think, to make choices about how you adjust things when you think of it as an experiment, as opposed to it being like, that it's all wrong. It doesn't mean that everything leading up to the outcome was wrong if you didn't get what you were hoping for. It means you need to adjust parts of, I won't say the formula, but of the experiment.
Yeah, and that it helps you be detached to some degree. It's like, okay, this music, it needs to be really meaningful and powerful, and I put my life into it. You can put just a lot of expectations onto the results, which can be, this is important to us, but you still have to be a little bit detached from all the data you're collecting and move forward from there. And not to harsh on math too much. Apparently, if you study mathematics at a very high level, it becomes as open and creative. It becomes a very beautiful, creative thing. I've never quite made it to that level, so I didn't experience that level of mathematics. But I hear it's there.
Well, and I think a lot of us learn mathematics with a lot of like memorization and semantic information and that and sometimes people learn science that way too. But kind of thinking about what you're doing as a system is more like what most of us would think of when we think of experimentation, is kind of working in these systems, but these systems that are kind of like a manageable, adjustable kind of playground, a serious playground, but a playground.
That's true. In science class, we had our science experiments. They were all dictated out of the textbook, and you had to do it a certain way, and the teacher knew in advance what the results would be if you did the experiment right. So not quite what we're talking about.
Yeah, more like the the scientist that's sort of driven by passion in their lab, kind of working in a more holistic way, as opposed to the textbook the textbook approach, perhaps.
Well, I think we can leave it there. Is this still within mini episode range? I think we did it.
So.
I think we kept it shorter than 40 minutes. So.
And please let us know if you have questions. Let us know where this takes you and how you relate to this, and what kind of experiments you've been doing or what you plan to do.
Yeah. You can connect with us at infiniteimprovisation.com. You can find our online community and send us a message.